Our speaker this morning is familiar to most of us. Rudy Cleare is going to continue a conversation he began with us when he was here last about religious traditions, about faith and principles, and how all that fits together. And he wants your thoughts too. I hope you came with your brains.
Disconnected from something else, which might mean that I broke something. There. Well, good morning, and hello again. As I've said before, I have reason to question the collective sanity of your society because you keep having me back.
Welcome.
Yeah, and I keep coming back, so. So, when I sent Martha the email, I said we might title this "More of the Same," because what I'd like to do is to just touch again on the themes that I introduced to you the last time I was here regarding this matter of what I call the faith religions breed. How do we develop a sense of faithfulness, of fidelity to the human enterprise? How do we explore what it means for us to be human together with a faith, with a fidelity, with a sense of faithfulness that is beyond our traditional and normal strains of religion and of religious thought. A bit of my thunder was stolen because I was going to start by saying to you that since I was with you last, this matter of thinking about how we are together beyond things that divide us like religion is, in case you haven't noticed, kind of hurtling to the forefront of American life in the political arena. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Having witnessed the two major political parties in their conventions, I saw and heard what I believe were two radically competing visions of the way we would do being human alive together. I saw two very, very different visions, and led me to believe that this is a critical moment when we do have to, harkening back to another theme I've touched on with you before, this is a time when we especially need to stop to think and learn to care. Remember, we've talked about all that before, stopping to think and learning to care, because it is on display. From my point of view, it is on display without doubt that we have wandered to the edge of a world that I call the unthinking, uncaring culture of the present age. People just do and say things without stopping to think, and often without bothering to care about what the consequence of that might be. So, we need to be doing this together. So let's look back very quickly at some things I laid out for you before. And I asked to have some information posted for you today so that you can follow along with me. And I'm just going to run past the stuff that I talked to you about before and then add a little more commentary to that. And I want to spend the bulk of our time pushing back and forth about what we think this means together, because this is a dialogue that's going to happen more in the American context. So I talked to you about the faith religion breeds. And what I failed to do the last time was to define for you what I believe religion to be. I'm going to give you a definition of religion which might or might not work for you, but it is, I think, a fairly sound definition of religion. I define religion as this, and it's not up there. I define religion as a mutually agreed starting point that is informed by shared perception of incorporeal meta-reality, what St. Paul would call that which is unseen, our perception of what is unseen. And we use that mutually agreed starting point, that starting point informed by our perception of what is unseen. Religious groups use that starting point often to interpret the corporeal reality in which they live, right? So there are all kinds there's all sorts of evidence throughout human history of social groupings doing this, that people somehow appropriate a perception of something outside of our reality. Some refer to it as the sacred. Some refer to it as a spirit. Some refer to it as a divine being. But we appropriate some notion. A group of people agree that they share a perception about incorporeal meta-reality, that which is unseen. And they use that to help inform their interpretation of the reality they do see. That, I believe, is the closest we can come to, or perhaps a universally agreed defining of the religious. It is the unseen, our perception of something unseen, that informs then how we think about what we do see. So I have said to you before that the best religious traditions are equal in this regard, that they should spawn faith-infused persons. Whatever your notion of the divine, the sacred, the spiritual, the metaphysical, whatever your perception of that might be, your religious tradition is helpful if it spawns in you a sense of faith. And that faith, what does it mean to be faith-infused? It means honoring the human condition as sacred, that what we do here somehow has a character of what we believe to be sacred. And we want to trust in the efficacy of the human enterprise, that what we do together has meaning and what we do together has worth. And then we want to remain faithful to values that promote the good in any and every human context. Say that again. So the best religious traditions are equal in this regard. They spawn faith-infused persons. And what does it mean to be faith-infused? It means honoring the human condition as sacred, trusting in the efficacy of human enterprise, and remaining faithful to values that promote the good in any and every human context. So, I want to hold it down. See if the light becomes green. Yes. Bingo! Ta-da! So, just quickly, does this make sense to you as a definition? Okay. And if this is true, if good religion, have you got good religion? If good religion breeds this kind of faithfulness, then is it safe to conclude that religion as an enterprise might have some worth, some value as part of what we do as human beings? Religion might have some value. From this perspective, again, we're not talking about partisan, sectarian, us against them, who said it first, if you do this, only this will save you. Not that kind of stuff. Just this notion of our believing in the worth of something beyond us infuses our sense that what we do has some sense of the sacred. What's ordinary then becomes sacred, because we have a faith. We have a confidence that it is good that we are together here as humans, and that what we do together matters, and that out of that we can influence the course of our reality. Make sense? Okay. So from there, next slide please, we then, I talked to you about the fact that I believe that this enterprise of trying to live faithfully as human beings together forces us to deal with this question of we've touched on before about what divides us as opposed to what unites us, and how do we as interreligious people, that is, religious people who come from different traditions, how do we breed a sense of pluralism? Now, we talk a lot about interfaith, and we talk a lot about ecumenical dialogue, but I think, again, it's beyond, my concern is beyond the religions talking to one another or being tolerant of each other. I'm way beyond that. I want to talk about how do we reinforce a regard for the other and an appreciation for the fact that our otherness does not necessarily make enemies of us. Okay, so in order for us, I think, to create this sense of pluralism, there are 4 characteristics to the pluralistic world. One is engagement. So I believe that pluralism, grounded in the faith religions breed, pluralism is achieved through the energetic engagement with diversity. We have to be actually open to that which is other. The second characteristic is understanding, that pluralism seeks understanding across the lines of difference, right? So the first thing is that you're willing to engage that which is different. The second is that you're curious enough to want to know more about what that different other is. The third thing is an encounter, that if you are then curious about this difference you recognize, this other you recognize, are we willing, do we have the courage to seek for a real-time encounter with the other? So that I'm not just gauging my reaction to it based on what I heard someone say or what I saw from afar, but I'm willing to actually kind of smash up against it and see what happens. So pluralism is realized as an encounter between the differences. And again, I use the word there, an encounter between commitments, because engagement with another, either being willing to put ourselves forward or welcoming someone else, does not mean that one has to give up one's commitment to who one is or what it is about me that makes me different from you, right? And you might know, I think you're skating close here to the edge of what I think is one of the major fault lines between, for lack of a better term, Hillaryism and Trumpism, whatever those two things, right? Because I think that what we're hearing from an awful lot of folks on the Trumpism sphere is, you have to become us in order to be acceptable to us. If you remain as you are, right, you are not worth enough to be in our camp. So if you want our label, whatever it is, American, Republican, blah, blah, if you want our label, right, you better pretty quickly show us that you are just like us. You're the mirror image of us. And you have to do all you can to subsume the stuff that made you different and act and be like us, right? I think that that's what I'm hearing in an awful lot of the rhetoric and the crowd response and all of that on that side. Whereas I just get I think a more calm sense from the other side that It's perfectly fine that you are who you are and that is other and different from us. We'll embrace being with you and see how this works, us being together. I think those are two radically different perspectives, two radically different starting points. But it has to do with this question of whether the encounter is based on your having to give up the commitment to who you are and what your reality is. The last characteristic of this pluralism is dialogue. That when we have this encounter, we're then willing to engage in a real exchange of information and ideas and maybe proposals for how we move on together. But then it isn't just a matter of like sitting side by side. We go to the movies and the movie house might be crowded, and so you're going up the things, and then you look, and then you see a seat open somewhere, and you kind of say, is anybody sitting there? And they say no. So you kind of crawl over everybody and all that, and you sit in your place, and you put your popcorn in place. The movie begins, and you never say another word to one person on either side of you. When it's all over, you clap together, you leave, right? So there's something like an encounter in that you were in the same physical space together, but no dialogue happened, right? So pluralism doesn't really happen without the complete panoply of those characteristics. That we're willing to engage, we try to seek understanding of, try to have a real encounter with, and then we're willing to dialogue with that which we encounter. Make sense? Sweet. Okay. Next up. What will pluralism breed? Before I do that, all right. Let's do this, and then I wrote something that I want to share with you in addition to this. Let's do this first. So after looking at the characteristics of pluralism, if we try to be pluralistic, if we try to engage in pluralism, what do we hope that we as a human society will get out of it? What are the outcomes of trying to be a pluralistic community? I laid out for you the last time 4 outcomes. One is openness. That we gain a greater sense, greater appreciation for a mindset that turns us outward and sparks interest in the unlike other. If we're truly pluralistic in our outlook, we're willing to be open to say, that's new and refreshing that's out there. And I want to be looking outward. I belong to a Roman Catholic tradition, which for much of its institutional history, certainly throughout medieval times and then into the 20th century, our church viewed ourselves primarily as what I would call a medieval town. We were a walled city of God. Medieval towns had giant walls around them, often with moats, right? So that we could protect and preserve what was within. If the enemy came against you, the peasants out in the fields, right, they left the gates open for a while so that the peasants could flee towards the town and get inside the gates as quickly as they could. Then you shut the gates and you barred them. And whoever was in, and whoever was out, right? So we regarded ourselves as that kind of walled city of God. That Catholicism and Christendom really, that we were God's walled city here in the barbaric and heathen wilderness of Satan's earth. Right? And occasionally we would, we'd throw our rod and reel. I went fishing for the first time in the ocean off the coast of Massachusetts by a couple of years. We throw our rod and reel out and over the wall, and 1 or 2 of the barren souls and we could bring you up over into our sacred kingdom. But we were really God's city on earth. Our church, in what we call the Second Vatican Council in the middle of the 20th century, decided that was no longer such a good idea. And a guy we called Good Pope John the 23rd, begged the church he called it agorgiamento. He said, fling open the windows and doors, right? Because the action is really happening out there, right? God is interested in us being a people who are on the journey through this world. We're not God's holy city protecting him from the world. God's real concern is for us to be him in the world and figure out how to have some kind of... So that sense of openness, of being willing to give up the walls and being willing to open the windows and doors, that sense of openness is one of the outcomes of true pluralism. A second outcome of pluralism is the notion that we've talked about so frequently of caring, learning to care. Being pluralistic in our outlook will increase our regard for the neighbor and for his or her concerns. We will care. We ought to learn to care. And being pluralistic can lead us, I think, to care. A third outcome is value sharing, that the pluralistic mindset encourages us to come to some agreement about what I value that you also value, and that is good. Remember I talked to you before about the Venn diagram? One circle, another circle. You can cross those circles and find places of confluence where what we value fundamentally is shared, and that is a good thing. A fourth outcome, I believe, would be common action, that a pluralistic mindset promotes communal work and social interaction. We can do something about global warming if we agree that climate change and its effects are important for all the human planet, right? Climate change is not, some wild-eyed progressives' attempt to bring down the corporate world. Climate change is a reality that is just impinging the welfare of our whole shared experience on planet Earth. Right? If we could come to that place of a Venn diagrammistic value, then we could begin to say, all right, so what are we? Whether we are, Mr. Big Megabucks corporate guy or, Mr. Worker on the factory floor. What are we going to do to try to make the situation better? Good. Okay, so again, makes sense. Recall that these are the things we touched on. Now, let's get into the weeds now, and now that I've laid that stuff out. Thank you very much for the slides. So, we have come to a point in human understanding where greater knowledge of the physical universe developed by the sciences. I'm causing a competition here, I think, huh? All right, there, all right. We have come to a point in human understanding where greater knowledge of the physical universe developed by the sciences is influencing and redefining our conceptions of both ultimate reality, that metaphysical reality, and our corporeal being. There are new belief systems of a genuinely religious nature arising all the time in civilized social settings everywhere. So religious belief, even when it posits divine being, does not actually begin with the supernatural. The starting point of this faith that religions breed, the starting point is rather with some phenomenon or element, experience, or person that has objective ontological existence. So basically what I'm saying to you is this. I believe that we start to think about things that are beyond us because of our experience of things that are near. I believe that the preacher says, thus says the Lord, this originated on high. But really, our sense of the Lord originated from our experience of either our contact with or a sense of lack of something here in our corporeal reality. We look out because we recognize that we stand here. We wonder about what is beyond because what is beyond is in relation to what is here. So if the typical starting point is with some phenomenon, element, experience, or person having objective ontological existence, and moreover, religious belief does not require theistic assignment. There doesn't have to be a God out there for us to think in religious terms of what is out there. Doesn't have to have a name, a being, an entity, a statue, or whatever that we objectify it as. Just there's a sense of the sacred that informs our religion. Albert Einstein, for instance, who was a complete atheist as far as anyone knows, at the same time embraced a sense of the mystical, he said, as the source of his scientific curiosity. And that was his religion. Einstein said it himself. There was some sense of the mystical. It was the source of his scientific curiosity. And that was his religion. The followers of Donald J. Trump, evangelical Christians among them, know him to be fully human, but they assign feelings of transcendence to their love of his personality and of their adherence to his utterances. And these things forge their alliance to his secular religious brand. I think that Trumpism and its ilk are kind of an expression of religion. We have to ask how valid that is, but it is for many people a religion. So our so-called great and mainstay religions now have unexpected company. Things like science, things like Trumpism, there are new phenomenons that join the panoply of the things we generally call the great religions. Really, if you look at the numbers of how many people in our culture seem to be responding to this call for a new nativism and nationalism and separatism within us. If you look at the numbers, that's a fairly sizable portion of our population that seem now to believe in a re-emerging, an emerging new way that some are calling Trumpism. I worry about that. So I say that to now get us ready to have this discussion because I think there is a competition for a religion, a new religion that informs us to do something other than be pluralistic. And I want to know what you think about that and what we should do about that. Somebody, Paula told me a joke earlier.
Of course she did.
Did Paula tell any of you the joke about the true story about the kid who falls at home and busts his eye and has to be taken to a trauma center? You know, his sister goes with him and they call his mom and dad and the neighbor calls and they take him down to the trauma center and they determine that he's going to have stitches in this little cut above his eye because it's bleeding profusely. And so he's laying on the table and the neighbor is holding his father, I think, is holding his feet down so he stays still. His mother is holding his right hand, his sister's holding his left hand, and, you know, they're kind of soothing him and getting him prepped for the fact that the doctor's going to come and do stitches. So the doctor comes in and the doctor says, well, I see you've got a problem and I've got to do this. So tell me, first of all, though, how old are you? And the little lad says, I can't tell you, they're holding my hands. And it's because when you're 3 and someone asks how old you are, you usually say this many. Right? Yeah. So anyway, so now, what does this mean? That we have wandered into a place where if what we've known before as religion in our lives could point us toward this notion of being pluralistic. But now we are faced with some kind of new, what I call new religious expressions. Again, not having anything necessarily to do with theism, but things that people are bound to, understandings they have from outside of themselves that inform their reality here and now. We seem to be at a place where there's a divide, and there's going to be this new competition for whether we should be pluralistic or whether we should be isolationistic and inward-looking. It's the old conundrum of the church as God's walled city on a hill or the church as God's people journeying through a messy world. Now, talk back to me.
Carl Packham, that story about being held down and stitches, and that could have been me about 40, 50 years ago, but anyway, neither here nor there. Listening to what you're saying, it sounds like this contact, this dialogue, really only stands a chance of being developed from the grassroots, because do the leaders involved have too much to lose by this contact in that the power they are gaining from it? It needs to be driven by the grassroots. I think therein lies the problem.
Yeah, you may very well be right. Remember when I was with you the last time, I told you that as a child, there was a clear understanding in my Roman Catholic tradition that we didn't go to other people's churches. And the central understanding was because our teaching was within the church, we've got the prime rib. We have Mass. We have the sacred order of the Eucharist. Why would we ever go to experience what others have that's inferior? Because, the teaching from on high that informed us said we have to hang on to who we are and keep it separate. So I think you're very right. It's possible that this dialogue, I think President Obama might have tried to do some of this in his 8 years, didn't get very far. Because as soon as he started talking about how are we going to reshape who we are, the opposing people started with the teaching that, he has no standing to tell us who we are because look at him. He's, this black guy that we don't trust and yada, 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 yada. So you may be right. Yes, next.
I'd like to respond with a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I think one of the most important first steps to take when identifying why this new religion is stopping pluralism is saying what exactly is that first barrier that we are reaching? Is it that we are afraid to engage in dialogue? Is it that it takes two to dialogue and the other does not wish to engage in that dialogue? What is that first step that we are missing? Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense.
Cool.
And I'm gonna posit a possible answer because I've been asking this question of myself over and over, and I've been having some discussions with other people about it. I think our first problem is we fear each other. Fear, people often operate out of weakness and out of fear. If you feel threatened by the other, right? You feel weakened. You want to say, no, I have to fight because I have to be stronger than you. Or if for some reason you believe, when Mr. Trump, respectfully, gave that rant the other night about, how he wants to love his black African Americans who are living in, filth and their homes and no jobs and their crazy schools. All of this, you. The message that I think much of his white audience was hearing was, we're going to get overrun by these barbarian hordes of black people who are in our midst. So I think that the problem is if you can instill fear, fear is often the beginning of our willingness to say we have to build a barrier. Right? We have a reason to be afraid of what's on the other side. Next. Yeah, there we go.
Hi. This is kind of a related comment and dealing with your stages to engagement and pluralism. I find it fascinating how so much of what's going on has kind of been forced upon us through culture and knowledge. Like whoever would have thought that 20 years ago we would know what a hijab and a burqa and a Shiite and a Sunni are.
Right.
We're educated people, and I know myself, I had never even thought about any of these things. So it's kind of happened matter-of-factly that way.
We have created a world in which, for the first time in human history, we are almost simultaneously informed of the world around us as it happens, right? It's true. We know. And a part of there's glory in that. There is glory in that. But there's also a kind of an indictment of us because we're the first generation in human history we cannot say we did not know. Right? In the future, when our grandchildren ask us, how did you let that happen? We cannot say, well, it was happening over in China and we didn't know. We didn't find out until 2 weeks after. This is the first generation where it's possible for it all to be in front of our faces at the same time. right? Part of the problem is it robs us of some of our excuses that we had in the past. But you're exactly right. We are informed. And that being informed, right, is one of the important parts of gaining understanding. If we know it, right, then we can figure out how to deal with it. If we claim we don't know, or if we draw a false picture. Remember, Bill Clinton at the Democratic National Convention did something that I thought was rhetorically brilliant. I hadn't seen it done so clearly before. He did this thing of saying, I met this girl. Remember? Da-da-da. And then he said, but some people don't know this girl. So they draw this cartoon of her. There's this other girl, right? And they talk about her all the time, right? They're ignoring the reality of who she really is because not willing to face that reality and deal with her as who she is, they created another caricature of her. It's a danger in our world that if we don't want to deal with what we know, we make up a new story for it. Our media might in part be responsible for some of that.
I was going to your second question when you said, well, what do we do about it?
Yes, ma'am.
And, you hit, when you said fear, that's always what I think about because I was so fortunate to be raised in a family that all we talked about was the blessings of other and different cultures. Yeah. It's hard for me to step out of that thinking to be afraid of other, but I also been taught I try not to react. So as a writer, as somebody who engages in dialogue, I think, well, how do you engage? I really don't like to engage in person with these. I'd rather do it in writing because it's safer. But to your questions, it is. And plus I can think before I speak when I'm writing. But how do you engage with people? As I think it goes back to what you said as fear. Try to step inside. Are they afraid they're losing jobs? Is the other taking something from me? And I'm not saying I'm agreeing with them. I'm saying I'm trying to teach myself to step into a place of where is the fear coming from and how could I come into that? And a lot of it is information. They're getting misinformation. And then some of it's lack of our willingness to be compassionate and say, where's that fear coming from? Because there's a whole bunch of people out there being nativists and nationalists that weren't talking before. And now Trump is their surrogate hate monger. And I don't.
Yeah.
So, I ask you, how do you approach, whether it's in writing or in person, with a more heartful understanding of where they're coming from, and then you can have dialogue.
Wow. Yeah. So I think the source, perhaps a starting point for being able to overcome that fear is humility with respect to myself and my own place in the world. And I say this because an awful lot of our time in the development of our human selves is spent on the question of my self-worth. And very often, we are taught to define our self-worth in relation to the worth of someone else. That if I give you worth, it robs me of worth. If I value you, I am somehow devalued. So remember the whole conundrum about this Black Lives Matter thing? As soon as there was this movement that said Black Lives Matter, there was immediate backlash that said, what do you mean? Like, only Black Lives Matter? Your life matters more than mine, but all lives matter because I'm not going to give up any, And I hadn't heard that. I hadn't even gone there when I first heard the Black Lives Matter thing. I just thought people were trying to react to this issue that young black lives are being lost in crazed situations where people don't know what to do in an encounter with law enforcement. That's what I thought was going on. But all of a sudden this huge, because I think there's this kind of, I talked to you before about these tapes that are in the back of our heads, these myths that shape our sense of me. I think we spend a lot of time in human civilization defining our worth as over against. It's always comparative, right? So wives under the law were valued as less than husbands, though they were both spouses, right? A daughter was valued as less than a son, though they were, right? It's the whole thing. This morning at my church, we had this reading from a letter of St. Paul about a guy named Philemon and his slave Onesimus. The slave was sent back to the master. The slave had been baptized into Christ. Paul says, now that I'm sending you back your slave, he is now your brother in Christ. What on earth do you do with that? If you are a master, somebody takes your slave away from you, they baptize the slave, and they send the slave back saying, he's now your equal in Christ because you're both baptized. How am I going to explain it to my other slaves? Right? So this whole notion of, I think this sense of our value being defined as opposed to the value of someone else causes us to develop this fear that if they get in my space, they're going to devalue who I am. We're
going to do one more.
Oh, God,
maybe
yeah.
I suggest after we finish service, maybe we could all group, put some chairs in a circle.
Yes, I'm happy to stay.
And talk.
Yeah, I'm happy to stay so we can get service done. Yes, I'm sorry, I wasn't even watching.
I'll try to do as quick as I can. I have a half brother who I really envy. He has been able, because of his savings, he actually has a law degree, and he decided to take time off. He's been traveling the world for the last 6 months, but he hasn't done the traditional thing a lot of people do where you go to Europe and you go to Paris and that. He actually went to India. He spent 3 months in India in the rural areas, and now he's over in Indonesia. So he wrote a long post on Facebook, and it's just so poignant here. I want to read it. It says, "Too many Americans are fearful of the outside world, but they haven't gone anywhere or seen anything to validate that fear. In my travels, Americans are definitely the minority amongst other Western travelers I have met. I don't think I am better than anyone for having traveled, but I do think I can express a more credible and informed opinion about the world than someone who gets all their info from the media."
Stop right there, please. Stop. Because I think you've said a world in those 3 sentences. What I'd ask you to do is go back and repeat the first sentence alone. Just go back and read the first sentence again.
Too many Americans are fearful of the outside world.
Bingo. Okay. All right. So we can continue this after.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rudy.